Welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is your host, Rachel Gregory. I really want to come up with a new intro. If anybody has any ideas of a fun way to introduce the show that isn't so, I feel like it's scripted. I just say the same thing every single time. But anyway, if you have any ideas, definitely hit me up. I'm interested. So today I have another Q&A episode for you. I feel like I say that same sentence every single time as well. But anyway, I'm going to stop rambling, but let's get into today's Q&A. We have a few questions, a few really good questions. They're always great questions, that I want to hit on. And as always, if you're enjoying this episode, I really would appreciate if you could share it out by either just sending it to a friend, whether that's via email, sharing the podcast via email, or sending it in a text message. You can share, if you're listening to this on iTunes, you can actually share the episode directly, so you can send it out as a text message. Or if you want to share it on social media, I always appreciate that. The best way to do that is take a screenshot of the episode or the podcast as you're listening to it. You can add it to your Instagram story, or I guess your Facebook story. Or if you have TikTok, you can add it to that. I do not currently have TikTok, but I think I might have to get it soon. Apparently everybody has it and I don't. So I don't know. We'll see. I'm thinking about it. But anyway, if you are enjoying the show, sharing it on social media is awesome, because that helps spread the word. So you can take a screenshot, add it, like I said, add it to your Facebook or Instagram story, and you can tag me at rachelgregory.cns. That's my Instagram handle, and I can share it out as well. And thank you for listening to the show, of course. So I will add my Instagram handle in the show notes. It's usually always there. So if you're, ever curious about, if you're not following me on Instagram and you want to, my handle is in the show notes. You can click the link there. And if you're not part of my Friday Flex newsletter, you can join that. That link is in the show notes as well. I believe it's linked as Rachel's newsletter. So just click that, and then you can enter your name and email, and you'll be added to my weekly newsletter, where I share tons of different things each week, depending on what's exciting, what's happening in my life, what I learn, any client shout outs or transformations, different recipes of the week, different flashbacks to blog posts or new blog posts. So there's a bunch of good stuff in there. So definitely, join the newsletter if you're interested. If not, it's totally cool. But yeah, let's get into today's questions and let's do it. All right, the first question is, can you explain losing body fat before building muscle, or should we focus on just building muscle and the fat loss will come? Okay, so this is kind of, it's like kind of a two-part question, but not really. I read this before and took some notes, but now I'm trying to figure out if it is two questions. It's kind of one question split into two. Okay, anyway, so the first thing I'm going to say is losing body fat primarily comes down to your nutrition, right? So what you're consuming on a daily basis, we know that in order to lose body fat, you have to be in a deficit, right? You have to be in some type of energy deficit. And the biggest component of that is what you're consuming on a daily basis and being aware of that and tracking that, right? So knowing, how many calories and how much energy you can consume to maintain your weight. And then we know once we have that we know, once we have that, we know your maintenance, then we can put you into what we call a fat loss phase or a cut or whatever it may be. And that means that we'll probably reduce that number a little bit, reduce that caloric intake in order to put you in a deficit. So that is the biggest component that we can control. You can also obviously get into a quote unquote deficit by expending more energy, but that in itself is more variable. So expending energy, that would be like your exercise on a daily basis, your movement on a daily basis. So like your NEAT, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which I talk about all the time. That would be like your steps and just your movement, all of your movement outside of the gym. So that would be energy out. But that is, and then there's other components as well, but that is more variable and kind of harder to track. So I would say losing body fat, if that is your main goal, that comes down primarily to nutrition. So when we're going into this question though, which again is, can you explain losing body fat before building muscle, or should we focus on just building muscle and the fat loss will come. So I think it really depends where you're coming from and how advanced you are versus how not advanced you are. So if you are someone who is just starting off like a lifting program, right? If you have never lifted weights before, or maybe you have been, participating in like circuit training classes like CrossFit or Orange Theory or something like that, and then you switch to following a more progressive lifting program. So this is actually like what happened with me. I did CrossFit for many years, and then once I actually got injured and had to switch gears, I ended up following I ended up going back to like a regular gym and hired my own coach and started following a more progressive program. That's actually when I saw the most changes in my body composition. And so during that period, I was actually able to what we call body recomp. So this just means you are actually building muscle and losing body fat at the same time. So it is possible. It is possible to lose body fat and build muscle at the same time. But I think it comes down to where you're coming from. So someone who is either completely new to lifting and has never followed a progressive or a progressive overload is, what I talk about all the time. You have to be progressively overloading. You have to overload your muscles. You have to do a little bit more every time you go into the gym and progress. If you never followed a progression like that or a long-term plan like that, then it's much easier for you to quote unquote recomp because the stimulus is new, right? Or if you're someone who's coming from, like I said, a circuit training class like CrossFit or Orange Theory, and then you go and you start to follow a more progressive program where you're tracking, your weights, your reps, your sets every single time. You're focusing on following a structured, very strategic program, then you will probably be able to recomp easier as well. Versus someone who is maybe more advanced or intermediate or advanced who has been lifting for a while and following a progressive, well thought out program for a while, it might be a little bit harder for them. So that just comes down to kind of where you're coming from, right? And so body recomposition is absolutely possible. So that means, building muscle and losing body fat at the same time. And that's actually what happened with me when I did go from CrossFit to following a progressive program. I was able to recomp my body. So I was able to lose body fat and gain muscle at the same time. Whereas now I feel like I'm a little bit more advanced. So with someone who is more advanced, it's actually a little bit harder to recomp. It's not impossible, but it is a little bit harder. So I would say that, following more of a periodization and looking more at the long term and going through different phases is probably your best bet in terms of in terms of setting specific goals at specific times, right? So if your goal is primarily losing body fat, then you have to be in a deficit, and we have to focus on that goal versus focusing primarily on building muscle. So that would mean maybe we periodize your plan and focus on, say a 12-week fat loss phase where you go into a deficit, you're still training, but you are focused more on losing body fat, you're in a deficit, maybe training is not, or maybe your performance in the gym is not optimized, right? You're not getting as much out of it as you could if you were not in a deficit. Obviously that makes sense because you just don't have as much energy coming in. So so hopefully that makes sense. And then you go through kind of that fat loss phase. And then once you've gone through that, then we go into maybe a reverse diet. So not maybe, but this is how I would kind of bring a client through this is if we go through a fat loss phase, then we reverse out of that. So, for a few weeks, we bring you back up to your new maintenance, and then you're hanging out at maintenance for a while. And then if you want to focus on building muscle, this would be the time to focus on that. So you would be at maintenance. So you'd be consuming either maintenance calories or a bit of a surplus, and you can focus on progressing in the gym and really focus on building muscle. And this is kind of what we call a lean gains phase. This is actually what I'm about to be in now. So Like I said, I'm a little bit more advanced now, so I now go through, or I actually just finished up a cut about a month ago, 2 months ago. Then I reversed out for a few weeks. And now I'm at maintenance, my new maintenance intake, which is actually pretty similar to what it was before, but that's another story. But anyway, so now I'm focused more on my performance in the gym, right, and building muscle. And then if I want to cut again down the line, then I'll do that. But it's kind of, I mean, it's kind of like this, if you know anything about bodybuilding, it's really like that's kind of the bodybuilding way of doing things, I guess you could say. But when it comes to building muscle and losing body fat, we have to kind of understand where we're coming from, right? And you have to understand the goal, like what is the goal at that time? Because if you're chasing all these different things, if you're chasing optimal performance in the gym, if you're chasing optimal fat loss, like it's hard to do those things at the same time just because of the nature of what you're doing. So I don't know if I answered that question, but I'm going to read it again just so that I can make sure I did. So it said, can you explain losing body fat before building muscle, or should we focus on just building muscle and the fat loss will come? So the second part of that question, or should we focus on just building muscle and the fat loss will come? Again, I think it comes down to where you're coming from, whether you're a newbie or you haven't followed a progressive program in the past, or if you're more intermediate or advanced and you need to go through different phases or periodization and stuff like that. So again, I think it just comes down to that. But I would say that if the main goal is losing body fat, that should be the main focus. If the main goal is building muscle, that should be the main focus. And again, I always say this, but having a coach to help you work through this is probably very advantageous. I always say I have my own coach. I coach clients. I think having someone there to help you plan out and figure out what your goal is and have a plan to attack is super important. So anyway, I think I rambled on enough about that. Hopefully I answered that question. It was a little bit confusing. Hopefully it wasn't confusing. I mean, sorry. But yeah, if I didn't answer it, let me know and I will, I'll dive deeper into that subject. Okay. The next question is kind of related to the last question, but it's how to build muscle after 60. Okay, so this is a great question. And I think that, well, first I just want to hit on kind of the basics for building muscle, right? So there are specific basics that we need to have in place in order to build muscle optimally, right? So the first one is having a proper resistance training program. I talk about this all the time, having a long-term plan, something that is well thought out, includes progressive overload, includes a plan that is both enjoyable, but also gets you results. That is super important. So in order to build muscle, you have to stimulate your muscles. You have to break them down to build them up. You have to, again, be progressively overloading. Basically, that just, again, it means that your body adapts to progressions over time, right? So each week you have to be doing a little bit more, whether that's an extra rep, a little bit of added weight, maybe it's a little bit of less rest between sets, maybe it's more sets, maybe it's closer to failure, whatever it is, you have to be progressing because you have to be stimulating your muscles on a continuous basis because our body adapts, right? So if we're not continuously stimulating them and including that progression, then we're never going to grow. So that's one of the biggest things when it comes to building muscle. You have to be progressing. Another thing is recovering. So the opposite of breaking down our muscles, right, is to build them up. This actually occurs when we're recovering, right? So recovery includes, how much sleep we're getting each night, the quality of our sleep. Are we fueling appropriate, right? So I just talked about in the last question about whether, if you're in a deficit, if you're in a calorie deficit, that means that you have less energy coming in. So that might not be as advantageous or we know it's not as advantageous for building muscle because you're not getting adequate fuel to those muscles. Not saying that you can't build muscle. I just talked about body recomposition. But if the main goal is to build muscle, then you have to be fueling appropriately. You have to be managing stress, right? Stress, we don't think about that being something that some people don't think about that lining up with building muscle, but it is a big part of it. If you're chronically stressed out, you have high cortisol levels. I'm going to talk about this in a second, but cortisol is a catabolic hormone. Catabolic means you're in a state of breaking down. Anabolic means building up. So when we think of building muscle, we want to be more in that anabolic state. So if you're chronically stressed, if you're not sleeping, you're not getting quality sleep, and your cortisol is chronically high, like that is not a good situation for building muscle. What else? Those are just the basics, right? Again, I said fueling appropriately. So, having a caloric intake at maintenance level calories or in a slight surplus is going to be, that is going to be where it's at when you want to focus on building muscle. And then also consuming nutrient dense real food, right? And tailoring your consumption to optimizing performance. That is super important as well. If you're not consuming adequate nutrients, you're not giving your body the building blocks it needs to build muscle, right? And then with that includes protein. Of course, protein is super important. I talk about it all the time, but you need adequate protein to build muscle. So those are the basics. So when it comes to building muscle after 60, really all of the things that I just talked about apply to that, right? So I'll give you kind of like 3 main things to make sure that you're doing. So the first one is, like I said, you need a progressive resistance training program. I would say if you are not, if you haven't been lifting weights, prior to this, or if you're just trying to start lifting weights, I would say starting off with at least 3 times per week. Maybe a full body program is a good place to start. So full body 3 times per week. If you're interested, my Level Up program is a 3 times per week full body 3-month program. I have that on my website. I'll link that in the show notes. But following a progressive resistance program and tracking your weights, sets, reps to make sure that you are progressing is super, super important. So that in itself is, you have to do that, right? You have to follow a progressive resistance training program. You have to lift weights, lift heavy weights, and continue to progress in order to build muscle. Also, I would say that you want to make sure your program is something that is fun as well and is challenging for you. So you want training, you want, lifting weights to be challenging. It has to be hard. That's how we, grow, right? That's how we grow both physically and mentally. And we're able to, and that's why I love, if you're someone who doesn't lift weights and you're confused why people love lifting weights, it's because there's a challenge there, usually, hopefully. And that challenge is not just physical, but it's mental as well. And so having a challenge is super important. And this is not just for people over 60, right? This is for anybody. But you want it to be fun, you want it to be challenging, and you really just want to follow a plan that allows you to, again, enjoy what you're doing, allows you to stay motivated and progressively overload week to week. Those are the basics of following having a good progressive resistance training program. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is fueling appropriately. And this mainly comes down to making sure you are fueling appropriately, but one of the biggest things is adequate protein, right? So I talk about this all the time, but especially when we're talking about building muscle over 60, muscle breakdown goes up as we age, and therefore protein needs go up. And this is something that I don't think it's talked about as much as it should be, but as you age, you actually need more protein. And so specifically when we look at something called the Leucine Threshold, if you don't know what this is, I actually talked about this on my Instagram story a few weeks ago now, I think. But leucine it's an amino acid, right? Amino acids are the building blocks of protein. So leucine is an amino acid that actually stimulates muscle protein synthesis. Muscle protein synthesis is it just means building muscle, right? So it's like this light switch that goes on. So if you don't kind of pass this leucine threshold, that light switch never really gets turned on. So we need to consume a certain amount of protein in one sitting before we actually stimulate this muscle protein synthesis or stimulate this this or get past this threshold. Again, you can think of it kind of like a light switch. And there really isn't an exact value for when this switch kind of gets turned on, but in general, consuming a minimum of about 20 to 25 grams of high quality protein, that's minimum high quality protein within each meal, will hit that threshold. So minimum is 20 grams, and that's for someone who's probably like a female who's, smaller body weight. It depends on your body weight, but that would be minimum. I would say anywhere up to like 40 to 45 grams, even more for someone who's bigger. So that is important to realize that also this threshold, right? So the leucine threshold is what, once we get past that threshold, we can turn on that switch for muscle protein synthesis, which basically just means that we can turn on that switch to build muscle. And this threshold actually goes up as we age. Again, as muscle breakdown goes up, this threshold goes up, which means that we need more protein. And we need more protein specifically within each meal, and we need to be able to consume enough to hit that threshold. And as we age, it's harder. So hopefully that made sense. So as you are thinking about building muscle, especially if you're not consuming adequate protein, and if you're not kind of going past that threshold and turning that light switch on, it's gonna be a lot harder for you to actually build muscle. So increasing protein allows you to optimize muscle protein synthesis, it's a hard word to say, to the highest degree. And when we have a high rate of muscle protein synthesis, when we have a high rate of muscle protein synthesis, we can recover better and build more muscle. So that's something to just pay attention to. You must be consuming adequate, high quality protein within each meal that you're consuming, especially if you are, over the age of 60 or over the age of 50, or you're, as you age, just think a little bit more protein every year, right? Super important. And the third thing is adequate recovery. So like I said, when you are lifting weights, you're breaking down your muscles, right? You're breaking down the muscle fibers. When you're actually sleeping and recovering and things like that, that is when you are building, right? That's the building phase. So if we look at what muscle growth actually is, it's a balance between stress and adaptation, right? Training the muscle during our workouts is the stress, which is obviously necessary in order to elicit that growth and that change. But the recovery part of it is super important. So the recovery part would be primarily sleep, amongst other things like proper nutrition, stress reduction. All of those are included in recovery. This is a time where our body can actually stop to rebuild that tissue that's been broken down and recover from that stress. So really, like, every system in our body goes into repair mode during sleep. Our nervous system goes into that parasympathetic state, or mode, if you want to call it. So that just means the rest and digest mode. So you're in that state to recover. We know, like, when we're sleeping, our growth hormone skyrockets, our metabolism kicks up, we give our digestion a break, our joints are able to recover, and inflammation goes down, things like that. Like, these are all things that happen when we sleep. So if we are not getting adequate sleep, then we're not recovering properly. So again, going back to kind of the three main things that I would focus on, if your goal is to build muscle over the age of 60, make sure you're following and really just in general, not even over the age of 60, but everybody should be doing this, but especially over the age of 60. The first thing is you need a progressive resistance training program, and you need to follow it for a long period of time, right? Have something strategic in place. The second is adequate protein. Probably a little bit more than you think that you need. You probably need more protein. Did I record an episode on protein? No, I need to do that. I'll record an episode all about protein. I actually have a lesson in my Keto for Women program that's all about protein, but I don't think I've recorded an actual podcast on protein or the importance of it. I did write a blog post, which I'll link in the show notes, It's called Protein is Queen, so I'll link that. But that's the second thing, making sure you're having adequate protein, especially enough protein at each meal so we can stimulate that muscle protein synthesis and turn that light switch on and get past that threshold. And I will say another thing about this leucine threshold, which I didn't really dive into it too much. But leucine, like I said, it's an amino acid. It's an essential amino acid. So you need to make sure also that you're consuming high quality foods that include a good amount of leucine, right? And so really, animal products and high quality animal products and dairy and things like that, those are usually what have the most bioavailable form of not just proteins and amino acids, but they have a lot of leucine compared to other kind of plant-based protein. So that's something to be aware of, right? We need leucine to get to that. We need to pass that leucine threshold to turn that light switch on for muscle protein synthesis. So if you're not getting adequate protein and you're not getting an adequate amino acids from that protein or essential amino acids, then that's something to realize. And again, essential amino acids just means, so I won't go into too much on protein, but we have protein is made up of amino acids, right? And so there's non-essential and essential amino acids. Essential amino acids just means that they are essential to your nutrition because your body cannot make them. So they are essential. You have to get them from the food you eat, versus non-essential amino acids are amino acids that your body can actually make on its own, right? So they're non-essential. You don't necessarily have to get them from your food. So leucine is one of these essential amino acids. You've probably heard of BCAAs before. Leucine, valine, and isoleucine are the 3 BCAAs. But in order to get adequate leucine, you have to be consuming foods that are high in leucine or have an adequate amount of that. And you have to, in order to hit that leucine threshold or hit that muscle protein synthesis threshold, you have to consume you have to consume a good amount of protein in each meal. So I would say minimal 20, 25 grams in each sitting. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. And then third is adequate recovery. So making sure that you're sleeping enough each night. I would say 7 to 9 hours is what I recommend. It's usually what most people recommend, and making sure that's good quality sleep as well. And then also thinking of other recovery things. So making sure, your nutrition's on point, that is part of recovery as well. Making sure that you are not chronically stressed out. So doing things to de-stress on a daily basis, that's super important. And yeah, so that would be the third thing, adequate recovery. So hopefully that answered your question. Okay, the next question is, do you need to liberate carbs more to build muscle? ? Sorry, I thought there was more to that question. Okay, so the answer to this is it depends. Potentially not. So from my experience for myself and with clients over the years, it really just all comes down to what makes you feel the best during and after your training, right? So we know that you can build muscle following a ketogenic diet, even a strict ketogenic diet. There's been studies on it. I've done a study on it myself. We know that you can build muscle and lose body fat and maintain your lean body mass and even build your lean body mass, which would just be building muscle. But we know that that's possible. But is it optimal is another question, or another factor that we need to consider. So to build muscle, it isn't, like I said, it isn't essential to consume carbs. Building muscle is mostly, like we just talked about, it's the result of resistance training, adequate protein intake, and enough energy or calories. Those are kind of the basics. And then also recovery, right? Everything I just talked about. So whether that energy comes from, in terms of calories and energy, whether that energy comes from fats, carbs, or even stored body fat, it really doesn't matter. So, but then when we kind of think about optimizing muscle growth and optimizing building muscle, I think that carbs can play a role in improving performance and also optimizing recovery in a few different ways. And so this is something that I've just learned over the years. When I first got into keto and the low carb space, I kind of demonized carbs for a while, but then as I learned and grew myself and started working with clients who had different goals, it started to become more apparent that including carbs it really just depends on the person, right? It depends on where you're at, where you're coming from, what your goal is. If you are someone who is, super overweight, or even if you're not overweight and you don't, exercise on a daily basis, then maybe you don't need that many carbs. If you're someone who is in the gym, 4 or 5 days a week and your main goal is to build muscle, then I would say maybe you do need a little bit more carbs. And can you still follow a low carb diet? Absolutely. But it just comes back to strategically implementing those carbs for you and for what makes you feel good, makes you recover well. In the end allows you to progress and build muscle and get results that you are looking for. So I will say that it's not essential, right? You don't need carbs to build muscle, but I think it can help, especially if you are someone whose main goal is to build muscle, and that's the main goal, right? And so the reason why carbs can help are a few different reasons. So I did actually record an episode all about carbs. It was episode 18. I believe it was called Carb Ups, Carb Cycling, and I don't remember the exact title. I will link it in the show notes. It's episode 18. But in terms of including, or maybe the question asked, do you need to liberate carbs more to build muscle? In terms of the benefits of potentially liberating carbs would be having a little bit of an increase in energy, reducing perceived exertion, potentially delaying fatigue, right? If we can do that, we can, move more weight in the gym. We can progress more. And then another one would be refilling muscle glycogen stores. And then lastly, and this is something that I think is kind of underrated and something that a concept I didn't really understand or think about until a few years ago, is just reducing stress by suppressing cortisol. So we talked about how cortisol is the stress hormone. If we have chronically high elevated cortisol, it can be super hard to build muscle. So carbs can actually help blunt cortisol, which can really take us out of that catabolic state and into that more anabolic state, like I talked about, right? So if we can manage cortisol better, we can potentially build more muscle, right? And consuming carbs at the right times can actually help with this cortisol blunt, is what we call it, right? So especially post-workout, when you're, right after you've worked out, including post-workout carbs is one of something that I personally do. It can help to blunt that cortisol response, because we know that insulin and cortisol are opposing hormones. So if you consume carbohydrates, you are obviously spiking insulin. And with that spike in insulin, you are bringing cortisol down. So again, it's all dependent on the person and where you're coming from. But these are just some of the kind of reasons and some of the things that I found over the years and that I've learned about and implemented myself for reasons to potentially liberate carbs. And you can also think about this, if you are staying low carb, including or even keto, including carbs around your workout, is something that is definitely, I know a lot of people do that, especially in the low carb keto space. So that would be more like a targeted ketogenic approach. So that can be super helpful. And advantageous for building muscle. But again, it just comes down to where you're coming from and what your goal is. And if you haven't tried, increasing your carbs, and if you've been at a plateau and you haven't been able to build muscle, then I think, it's worth a try. I always say start off with a minimal effective dose. So maybe you include some carbs around your workouts, right? In the maybe pre-workout or maybe post-workout or maybe both. And see how it goes. See if you start to perform better. See if you are recovering better. Just test it out, right? You'll never know unless you test for yourself. Everybody is different. So yeah, that would be my answer to that question. Okay, the next question, how can I deal with training lifting specifically and intermittent fasting? Okay, good question. So I guess, to answer this question, it really comes down to what the goal is, right? So you said lifting specifically, how do you deal with intermittent fasting? I mean, this is hard to answer because everybody is so different, right? There's some people who feel absolutely amazing lifting and working out in a fasted state. There's some people who have no energy and they have to have some food in them in order to perform optimally. But then it also comes down to your goal, right? So what is your overall goal? Is your overall goal to lose body fat? Or is it to build muscle? Or is it to maintain? So if your overall goal is to lose body fat, then, what does intermittent fasting help you to adhere to your, daily intake? If it does, then, I would stick with that. If your overall goal is to build muscle, then potentially fasting, potentially including intermittent fasting, every single day for a long period of time. I mean, it depends. There's so many different versions of intermittent fasting. There's so many different ways to intermittent fast in terms of, how long you're fasting for or how long your eating window is. But I would say if the main goal is to build muscle, we have to kind of think about what fasting is, right? When you're fasting, again, this goes back to that catabolic and anabolic state that we are in. And also goes back to that muscle protein synthesis we just talked about. So if you're fasting, you're more in a catabolic state, which just means like you're breaking down, right? You don't have energy coming in. You're breaking down fuel within your body to use as energy. So that would be considered a catabolic state. If the goal is to build muscle, then we want you probably to be in an anabolic state more often than in a catabolic state, right? We want you to be stimulating that muscle protein synthesis and getting past that threshold as much as possible throughout the day. So if the main goal is to build muscle, then I would say, I don't think it's definitely not impossible while intermittent fasting. But I think you have to kind of think about this in a practical sense, right? So if we want you in that anabolic state, having more, food coming in throughout the day, having more protein feedings, hitting that light switch, turning that light switch on more often throughout the day is probably more advantageous to building muscle. And that could be potentially harder if you are, consistently or chronically fasting. But again, it doesn't mean that you can't build muscle while you're fasting. It just means that you have to kind of think about where you're coming from, think about how much you're fasting, think about how much protein you're eating. So that would be my answer to that question. But again, it also comes down to the goal. So the original question was, how can I deal with training and intermittent fasting? It comes down to the goal, and it also comes down to how you feel, right? How do you feel when you're training? If your main goal is to optimize your performance, which, I mean, it sounds like it probably is because you're asking how to deal with training, lifting specifically. If your main goal is to optimize performance, then you have to feel good in the gym, right? So what makes you feel good? What makes you perform at your best? Is it lifting in a fasted state? Is it lifting with some food in your stomach? Everybody's different, right? So, but I would just, consider everything I talked about in the previous questions about what it takes to build muscle, right? And thinking about that in the context of this question. So hopefully that makes sense. And then the last question for today is actually another fasting question as well. It says, how often do you recommend fasting? So this is a hard question. I just stuttered like 5 times in a row. It just depends, right? It depends on what your goals are. It depends on where you're coming from. It depends on I talk about this a little bit too, like with women versus men. Sometimes fasting can be a bigger stress on women than men. Usually men can handle fasting a little bit, easier than women. But yeah, it just depends on what your goal is. I don't really have like a specific recommendation for how often to fast. It just really comes down to what your goal is with fasting, right? I would say be wary of, especially if you are a woman, be wary of how much you're fasting and how, like, if you're chronically fasting, if you're having issues in terms of low energy, hair loss, muscle loss, things like that. Like that is something to be aware of. I would also say, go back and listen to the episode I did with Mike Mutzel. It's actually literally called the fasting episode. We dive into so many different topics. I think we dive into pretty much every topic or every question that I've ever gotten on fasting. So I would definitely go back and listen to that. I will link that in the show notes. It's the episode again. I forget exactly what the number is, but I'll link it in the show notes with Mike Mutzel, the fasting episode. Hopefully you'll get some answers from that. All right, that's all we got for today. Thank you for listening to this Q&A. For everything I talked about in this episode, you can swipe up if you're listening to this on iTunes to check out the show notes, or you can go to my blog or my website, which I will link in the show notes as well, to view all of these, or to view all of the show notes for all of the episodes that come out on MetFlex and Chill. And to anything that I mentioned in the episode, all of the links will be in the show notes. So if you're enjoying this podcast, as always, I would really appreciate if you could share it out to anybody, whether that's on social media or sharing it with a friend or a family member via text message or email or whatever it is. If you think that this episode or any of the other episodes that you've listened to on the podcast would resonate with them, please share it out. My goal with this podcast is to just help you as much as possible and answer your questions and teach and learn myself from our guests. And yeah, all right, I'm going to stop rambling on. But anyway, I hope that this episode was useful to you, and definitely continue to ask me questions. I love recording these episodes, and there'll be more to come. All right, I'll see you next time.